In this lesson, I'm going to explain how to smooth out shaky footage using the Warp Stabilizer effect. So let's go to Working Files, open up Projects, and go on down to 1006 Warp Stabilizer. You use the Warp Stabilizer to deal with a couple of problems. One might be a handheld camera like this one, with a little bit of camera movement like that. And you want to minimize the camera movement, or smooth out the camera movement, or remove the movement altogether. It kind of depends on the choices you make when you apply the effect. And then the other time is when you've got a lot of motion in it, like this point of view shot, where the camera's kind of bouncing all over the place here. I was holding the camera with one hand here while holding the handlebars with the other hand, trying not to fall down. So you do get these kind of shaky camera moves, and so you want to smooth out the camera moves using this effect. So the Warp Stabilizer is over inside the Effects panel, over there under Video Effects, and go down to Distort. You might find it mildly humorous to find Warp Stabilizer in the Distort group, but you are kind of changing the way the video looks, moving it around a bit, so I guess it belongs in Distort. Now I'm going to drag it to the first clip here, and the moment I do that, it's going to start analyzing the clip. It does that automatically by default, and that's okay. It's analyzing the clip now and noting objects inside the clip and keeping track of them. So later, when it tries to compensate for that, whichever direction the object moved, it'll compensate by going in the opposite direction. That's the general approach. If you've got a lot of action in the shot, then it just keeps track of a lot of things and then tries to sort of smooth out that action. So the analysis can take a while. It might take a few minutes for a clip that's only 10 seconds long. So I'm going to pause the recording here. That was about a 3-minute process for this 10-second clip. And when that process is completed, it then stabilizes the clip using these presets here. Smooth motion for the stabilization, for the smoothness method, something called subspace warp, and for the borders framing, the stabilize, crop, and auto scale. Now you might have noticed that when the stabilization was done, the framing changed. I'll turn off the stabilizer for a moment. And that's the original frame. This is the stabilized frame. What happens when you use the Warp Stabilizer is that it tends to zoom in on the clip, kind of cropping around the edges. Because otherwise, if it just kept it at its regular place and tried to compensate for motion, you'd see a lot of black around the edges here as it moved the clip around to compensate for any motion. So it does tend to zoom in. It does tend to crop. Let's take a look at the final results here. So you can see the camera move there is much smoother now, barely noticeable. And any kind of shakiness that was going on here, which wasn't much, has been taken care of. Everything gets a little bit smoother when you use it. There are a number of options here. You can have smooth motion or no motion. No motion locks down the camera. There'll be virtually no camera motion here, but what happens when it does this is that it really crops it a lot. If it's any kind of panning or tilting, it cuts out all the areas that would have been panned or tilted. So look at how much was cut out of that. If I turn it off, there's the original, there's the cropped version, the stabilized version. So no motion is useful if you've got a steady shot with hardly any kind of panning or zooming. Otherwise, you'd cut off a lot of the clip. So I'm going to go back to the smooth motion there. Now notice every time you change one of these things, it re-stabilizes. It doesn't reanalyze, it just re-stabilizes, which is a good thing because the analysis takes a long time, but the stabilizing doesn't take anywhere near as much time. Let's go down to method here. It's 4 different methods, each one a little bit more complex than the other. Subspace warp can actually kind of warp things inside the image, depending on how much action there is. So you need to check it out after it's done to make sure things don't look like they're bending, like this little bar here could have bent under subspace warp. This time it didn't bend, but sometimes with subspace warp you're going to find things are a little twisted and contorted, so you want to check that out. We'll start at the top here and run through here and see how they work. Go to position only. And position just tries to keep things more or less stable, but it might let things rotate a little bit. So the motion of the camera might be a little bit more obvious under this circumstance. See how that works? A little bit more jerkiness to the camera. So position is kind of the low end of the stabilizing. If you use position, scale, and rotation, the stabilizer tries to find objects here, and if it sees them kind of torquing, like twisting a little bit, it compensates for that twist to try to keep the twisting out of the final shot. So it just kind of keeps things steady. It's pretty close to the subspace, but it doesn't twist things anywhere near as much. So this is kind of the one that I aim for when I'm trying to avoid getting funny little artifacts of twisted things inside there. And then perspective is very similar. Barely any difference. So you can cut through these guys. If you decide that subspace warp is causing problems, just back up a couple of notches here to whichever one works for you. Down here, borders, this talks about the framing. Right now it says stabilize, crop, and auto scale. That's the default setting, which makes sense. What happens is it stabilizes it, it crops it, and then it scales it so it fills up wherever any black spaces would appear around the edges. If I say stabilize only, this is how things would have worked if you just did this thing manually. I'm going to play it now and see if we see any edges to it. If you look at that, you see little bits of black around the edges. Not much, but that's because the clip is moving around inside the frame to compensate for the motion. When we take a look at the bike rider, you're going to see those black things that are just off the charts in terms of how big they are. But here they're pretty subtle. So if you choose stabilize only, you'll have to compensate for the fact that these things are going off the edges like that. Then you'll need to crop it or scale it to compensate. If you move on down the line, you can stabilize and crop, so that will crop it. But then you see the black around there all the way. That's the way that it would have been done without any scaling. And the third one down actually does scale it. It does put it up to full size there. And finally, stabilize, synthesize edges makes your system work much harder, and you need to render this. This red bar here says that even my graphics processing unit can't handle the stabilize, synthesize edges thing. I need to render that part to be able to see it. So I'm going to go back to stabilize, crop, and autoscale. Okay, that's the basic way to do this. There are some advanced features which I'll leave for you to check out if you care to. Just taking the defaults usually works pretty well. Let's move over to the bike riding. We're going to analyze that, and this will take longer, so I'll just pause while that happens. I'm going to drag the warp stabilizer over here. Here we go. The warp stabilizer came from After Effects CS 5.5, the version of After Effects released 1 year before Premiere Pro CS 6, so I just made a little short trip from After Effects to Premiere Pro for this release. I'm going to pause the recording here. All right, it's wrapping up its analysis. So what's going to happen now is that it's going to then stabilize the clip using these presets here. What's good about the analysis, of course, that it keeps the information stored with the clip inside the project, so you can always flip around amongst the various stabilizing approaches. Notice what happened when the stabilization was done. I'm going to turn it off for a second. There's the original framing and the stabilized framing. It really crops off a lot, because this is a pretty busy clip. We got a lot of camera motion here, a lot of motion going on in the frame, and so it crops the heck out of it. Let's watch this. Pretty smooth camera moves now, but the detrimental thing about this is that it kind of cuts out the subject matter. Way tight there, sorry, you really can't see her there. So there's not much of this clip that'll be usable, just a few seconds here maybe where she's still in the frame, up to about there, then we start losing her. So the stabilizing really crops the heck out of this. Let me turn it off again so you see how much it crops there. And if I go down here to the borders, instead of stabilizing, cropping, and autoscale, I'll just stabilize. And now you get a chance to see how much work it's doing. You're going to see the clip moving around inside the frame here to give you a sense of what crop does. See how it compensates for the camera movement by moving the clip around while keeping the subject matter steady inside it, but it's also going to crop it there as part of the process. So that's the way it works kind of behind the scenes. And you get a chance to see that if you've got stabilize only. If I go stabilize and crop, you're going to see the edges, really how much is being cropped out. All this black area here was the original part of the clip. Now it's been cropped out, so you get a chance to see that was taken out, by the way. And if we get on stabilize, crop, and autoscale, we're going to get the same thing we had before. Now, if I switch back and forth amongst position, scale, rotation, perspective, and subspace warp, you're probably not going to notice too much difference when we get down to the bottom 2 or 3, because there isn't that much warping going on inside here. If I go back to position, scale, and rotation, which is the kind of fallback for me, it's the one that's sort of least damaging, the least potential for problems. You're not going to see too much here that looks like a distortion. When you watch the little telephone pole go by there, it looks like it kind of wobbles a little bit. If you look at the original version with the effect turned off, let's watch that telephone pole this time. This obviously shakes around a lot as the camera moves, but inside the stabilized version it looks just a little bit odd, the way it kind of slides back and forth there. That's just the way that the warp stabilizer works. So I think you can see that the warp stabilizer can be a powerful tool in your collection, but if you've got lots of motion in your clip, it tends to crop the heck out of it, and you may just decide you can live with the motion.